Today's session and panel, we have a distinguished panel today, and the session is appropriately coined Re-Awakening Bengal. What better a term in today's circumstances? The distinguished panel, starting with Mr. Sanjeev Sanyal. He is the principal economic advisor to the Government of India. However, he is in his personal capacity today as an author. His last book, among the various books that we have read of his, is called India in the Age of Ideas. Our next panelist, Mr. Swapan Dasgupta. He is a nominated member of Parliament of the Rajya Sabha, and his last book, most of us have read, is again Awakening Bharat Mata. Then we have two very young entrepreneur and investors and authors with us, Harsh and Rajiv, and their last best-selling book is called A New Idea of India. We have Ashutosh Poddar here. He's an entrepreneur. He will be moderating today's session. And we are happy to share that the whole event is being organized in collaboration with IEC. IEC is the Indian Enterprise Council. It's a think tank, non-partisan, non-profit think tank, which Harsh and Rajiv and various other members run. And we have Young Indians, organization spread across 54 cities, which is the youth arm of CII, and which strives for youth leadership and nation building activities. So without further ado, let me hand over the mic and proceedings to Anirudh and Ashutosh. Sorry. And over to you, Ashutosh. Let's begin.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for being here today. The topic for today's discussion is Reawakening Bengal. So, why Reawakening Bengal? Perhaps because Bengal was the awakened land. Art, culture, education, sciences, spirituality, you name it. Not only was it the awakened land, but it was also the land which provided a ray of awakening to the rest of the country, provided thought leadership to the national narrative of cultural nationalism, which led to the emergence of India as a civilizational nation state. Then we wonder, how did this awakened land of ours fall into a deep slumber? The optimist in me asks, how do we reawaken this ancient land? To answer these questions and more, we are joined this evening by a group of eminent minds, and as the only non-author and perhaps as the least eminent of them all, I seek your indulgence beforehand. The venue for today's discussion is also rather fitting. The erstwhile manor of Sir R.N. Mukherjee and Sir Birendranath Mukherjee, the foremost of Bengal's industrialists, builders of the Victoria Memorial and Belur Mutt, besides whom stood Lady Ranu Mukherjee, a connoisseur of art and culture, a muse to Tagore, who too was a frequent visitor to this venue. In this very ballroom, they hosted viceroys and revolutionaries alike, and in their departed company, we discuss Bengal's reawakening. We shall begin with brief opening remarks by Harsh and Rajiv, after which we'll come to Sanjeev and Dada, post which we shall have a discussion and some questions from the audience. With that, I request if Harsh would like to deliver his opening remarks.
Thank you so much, Ashutosh. Thank you to everybody who has turned out here today. It is indeed an amazing honor here to be with such distinguished co-panelists and such an important event at such an important turn of event for our state's history, indeed our nation's history. So, just very briefly about myself, I have more of a finance, economics background, although of course I've written about politics and philosophy. So, given my own background, I can't help but see Bengal through that lens. And when I see Bengal, what do I see? I see, of course, by Bengal, I mean West Bengal. You know, when you have childlike curiosity in school, you always thought, why is West Bengal in the east of India? But of course, we all understand the answer of that. So without going into that as of now, what is West Bengal? It's 90,000 square kilometers, around 100 million people today. So one of the most dense parts of the world. And generally, denser the part, more prosperous the part in human history. 100 million people, 90,000 square kilometers. It has got higher than average Indian literacy. So the literacy in Bengal is higher than the Indian average, but its per capita income is lower than the Indian average. And I think that's a very telling point in terms of the potential and where we are at right now. If, in fact, even during medieval times, despite all the, exploitation, etc., just Bengal or Greater Bengal, which would include Bangladesh, Bihar, parts of Odisha and Assam, were 12% of the world's economy. 12% of the world's economy. And if you just go to West Bengal of that, say 3% of the world's economy, if today West Bengal had 3% of the world's economy, its economy would be the size of all of India, around 2.5 trillion. So it's very important not to have incremental goals. It's understand what are we missing here. If you just open Google Maps and try to see, go from Calcutta to Siliguri, it is around 15 hours for less than 600 kilometers. In any other part of the developed world, that would be around 6 hours. So we have under-invested in the business environment. We've under-invested in physical infrastructure. And while we have excellent intellectual climate, unfortunately, the sons and daughters of this soil have to leave either for greener pastures in rest of India or outside of India itself. And Bengal has always been a trading hub. I mean, if you read Sanjeev's excellent books, he's written many of them. Tamra Lipti was a massive port on the Bengal-Odisha border. It's now near a town or village called Tamlak. And from there, people went to Southeast Asia, they went to Sri Lanka, they went to the eastern coast, Andhra region, and this totally spread all over. They spread Hinduism, they spread Buddhism, and the amount of gold and silver from Roman times till fairly recently, which would just deposit here, and Roman senators would complain about it. We were excellent producers of cotton and cotton cloth. Bengal muslin was required for the elite across the world. So from that to now, it is important to understand what we've lost, because otherwise we cannot picture what we can become again. And that's on the economic side. Even on the cultural, civilizational side, without what happened in 19th century Bengal, this kind of interaction of colonial Britain with the Bengali elite, we cannot imagine India and Hinduism of today, to be very honest. The way they kind of navigated the challenge of imperial Christianity while reforming Hinduism. There were many to's and fro's, 2 steps forward, 1 step back. But what the modern India that we are seeing building in front of our eyes, in many ways has its genesis in Bengal. So I think I'll stop at that for the moment as far as opening remarks are concerned. Rajiv?
Thank you, Harsh, for that whirlwind tour of Bengal and its history. So let me just offer one story of what Bengal was and how it was perceived about 50, 60 years ago. So Lee Kuan Yew, the founding Prime Minister of Singapore and the renowned statesman, he had said I think, shortly after Singapore got self-government in 1959, he had said that I want Singapore to be like Calcutta. Now, Lee Kuan Yew was born in 1923, and that was his worldview. At the age of 36, he became the Prime Minister of a city-state, and his ambition was that I want my city-state to be like Calcutta. Okay, so now let's fast forward about 4 decades. So, as Prime Minister, Atal Bihari Vajpayee goes to Singapore. And when he's in Singapore, he exclaims, "Yahan kya ho gaya? Ye to Calcutta jaise tha." So, meaning, in 4 decades, the positions had been swapped. Singapore, which used to be a mosquito-infested, swampy place, now transformed into a global metropolis. It had become like Calcutta of the old era. And Calcutta, which used to be, that kind of a place, kind of economically backward, etc. When Atalji went to Singapore, he thought that it used to be like Calcutta, and now look at it. So to me, this story captures best what has happened in Bengal over the last 5 odd decades, 6 odd decades. From being the center of trade, commerce, culture, today it is Calcutta and Bengal both are sort of seen among the lower ranks of the cities and states of India. And to me, all of this is self-inflicted. I don't think this had to be this way. In fact, with the kind of human resource, the kind of natural resource we have in the state, someone has had to work very hard to keep Bengal and Calcutta backward. And that is why, Re-Awakening Bengal, kind of reigniting the prosperity, the progress of the state and the city, I think is important not just for the region, but for the entire country. So with that, I'll pass it on to Sanjeev. I'm sure Sanjeev will have many more historical and economic anecdotes to share with us.
Thank you very much, Rajiv, and thank you to all of you. It's indeed a pleasure to be back in the city of my birth, to speak to you about a topic which I'm very passionate about and is an important part of my very first book called The Indian Renaissance. So whether you call it Reawakening or Renaissance or Rebirth, whatever you like to call it, this is a theme that pervades a lot of my writings. And so, and a lot of it is colored by my own personal experience. But remember, when I was born in 1970, Kolkata was not merely India's largest city. It was no longer India's capital, but it was clearly the most important economic hub. It had not yet been surpassed by Mumbai. The Kolkata Stock Exchange was still a force to reckon with, which comparable to the Bombay Stock Exchange. And there was a huge industrial zone around it. And by the time I was in my teens, it first lost its economic, but very quickly the intellectual, cultural, and many of the other clusters that were here just dissipated. And my generation in particular, and then subsequent generations as well, basically left the city. So let me make it very clear, Kolkata and Bengal did not die. It was murdered, and I am a witness to that murder. The question now is, can it be brought back? Whether you reawaken it or rebirth, whatever you may call it. So I'm going to speak a little bit about the fact that since and this is the Indian way of thinking, is about that time is cyclical. But it is so ups and downs of history happen. I mean, you go back to the Harappan civilization, the Iron Age, India and Bengal have gone through many cycles. So I'm quite sure we will go through another one. The question is, what are the preconditions that arise for allowing a rebirth? So, since I'm here as a writer and historian rather than an economist, so let me take you for a long range, if you will oblige and you will allow me. So, renaissances have happened in many places at various points in time. And one of the things that strikes you in every renaissance is the fact that it almost never happens in a silo. So when a renaissance happens in any society, it typically happens simultaneously in every field of human endeavor. So it will happen in the sciences, in commerce, and in arts, and in every other field of activity. You will certainly see an enormous amount of innovation, risk-taking, change happening simultaneously. It's almost a mindset at a point in time. So let me illustrate this point. When we go and think about, say, the European Renaissance, the term of Renaissance has now come to basically mean the arts and culture of, say, Venice or Florence and so on. That's what when we think of Renaissance, that's what we think. But in fact, the point about Florence was not paintings and sculpture. The point of Florence was that it was a hub for banking. The point about Venice was that it was the most important port and trading and commerce hub of Europe. In fact, many things like modern double entry bookkeeping, share trading, these are the real innovations of those city-states, and the art and culture we talk about is actually a side effect. And the same thing you see in Elizabethan Britain. Elizabethan England, we remember for Shakespeare, but in fact, it was a rising military power. It defeated the Armada. It had people like Drake who sailed around the world, and these were enormously risk-taking people, and they knew each other in many cases. And this is also interestingly true of the 19th century Bengal. So we tend to think of 19th century Bengal very often, the way our textbooks are written, we tend to remember, Dwarkanath Tagore, or we'll remember Raja Ram Mohan Roy, and so on. And it is true, as Rajiv and Har just pointed out, they've made extraordinary contributions. But it is also important to remember that Raja Ram Mohan Roy was actually a financier. Dwarkanath Tagore was a merchant. In fact, he was in fact a drug dealer because he made most of his money by dealing in opium, and so on and so forth. And even later, in the end of the 19th century into the early part of the 20th century, of course, extraordinary innovations happened in this part of the world, many of them in this building, I believe. So you had greats like Vivekanand or Netaji Subhash Bose and so on. But this was happening in a milieu where Bengalis were making contributions in other fields. You also had Tagore, and he had lots of business. Today people forget Bengalis through history were famous for being merchants and industrialists and so on. My own family, my mother's family, were businessmen. They were basically owned cotton mills in what is now Bangladesh. Some of you maybe even heard of them, called Mohini mills. They were one of the largest mill owners in India. Similarly, Swapan Dasgupta's family were also businessmen. I think Calcutta Chemicals. So, there was lots of business happening at the same time. There was all this innovation in arts happening, and all of these things were happening at the same time as political, spiritual, and religious churn was also happening, and very often done by the same people who all knew each other in many ways. Then, sadly, we developed somewhere in our head that it's a bad thing to aspire to economic prosperity. And this mindset, oddly enough, it didn't just kill off our commercial sort of energy, it also killed off everything else. We have never again produced a writer of the caliber of Tagore. Who is today's Tagore? I don't know. We've never produced anybody of the filmmaker of the caliber of Satyajit Ray, a political leader of the caliber of Netaji, a religious leader of the caliber of Vivekananda. So it all suddenly disappeared. And I think if we want to reawaken this, we first need to get these cobwebs out of our head that commercial success, innovation is a bad thing. This has been a major cultural failure because it then ended up pervading every other field of activity that we were doing. With that, let me stop and hand it over to Swapan.
The tone of this discussion so far has been a study of what might loosely be called declinology. We are sort of wallowing in decline. And that's a reality. I don't think anyone can escape from this. And at the same time, we talk about this glorious past, which makes this decline all the more stark. And it's often this invocation of the past which worries me quite a lot. There was a famous, there's a saying which my mother used to tell me in Bangla, which is saying, "Kobe ghee kheyechhilam hate ki konde." Yes, the smell of ghee which we had many generations ago still lingers now. So I think part of that problem remains very much with Bengal and no doubt with Bengalis. I remember Sanjeev was telling me just now of his birth in 1970. Now, I'm a bit older than you, Sanjeev, little bit. When I finished my school, that was just the genesis of the Naxalite movement. And it was impossible to complete a 3-year degree in 3 years because of the troubles, etc., and the experiences of others who were there before me and taken 4 or 5 years, etc., to finish a 3-year course. So I decided that I'm not going to risk it and I'll go off to Delhi and study. And when I was going off to Delhi, one of my elderly Jackamosais took me aside and says, "Baba, তুমি ভালো ছেলে, পড়াশোনায় ভালো করছো, কিন্তু দিল্লিতে কোনো কলেজ profound sense of arrogance which we had as Bengalis that the Calcutta may have been the second center of the empire, but it was also the second center of the world. As far as our world was concerned, it was the epicenter. Nothing existed beyond that. And believe me, when I went to Delhi, we used to look upon others as, Delhi is a sort of a hick town. We come here to study, but it was a hick town. Life ended there at 7:30, 8 o'clock in the evening. Look at the bright lights of Park Street. Look at how great Kolkata was, how cosmopolitan it was. And it was genuinely cosmopolitan at that time. I'm talking about the early 70s. It was genuinely cosmopolitan. We see some of the relics of that cosmopolitanism now. But the point is, it's taken us a very, very long time to acknowledge the reality of this decline. And even then, it's not complete. I think it was Harsh who spoke about the fact that, that there is this odd inverse relationship which exists between education and standard of living or GDP, whatever you want, still your economic. And in the case of Bengal, it's very stark. And here we have astonishing levels of literacy and in fact education. We can go as far as to say that. And here the standard. Now let's take it a step further, and let me be perverse. Is there a similar inverse relationship between economists and the economy we produced? At the risk of offending Swarajya. But I think there is. I think in Bengal, what was the Bengal Renaissance all about? Bengal Renaissance was essential. And Sanjeev has taken it to a laboratory and said, Venice and like Rostov, take off stage needs X amount of GDP to take off. He's taken Renaissance to a laboratory. Now, what essentially the Bengal Renaissance was all about was, if you really analyze it very, very clinically and a bit ruthlessly also, it was the Bengali intoxication with certain European ideas. And that was what it essentially was. And some of it produced tremendously positive results. But Europe was also not only famous for good ideas, Europe was also famous for bad ideas. And we somehow, at the end of the day, the filtration plants stopped working and we adopted all the bad ideas. And the most recent bad ideas was we had 30 years of disastrously bad ideas and 30 years of very bad rule. And then followed by another 10 years of even worse. So this sense of attraction towards bad ideas has continued. Today, when the time for some introspection has come, we are following in pride and saying, our bad ideas are better than your good ideas because they come from us and because you are outsiders. This is some of the logic, inherent logic which follows the political course. Now, what is it that we need when we talk about the revival of Bengal? Firstly, let's get certain things about it. Indian nationalism, as we knew it in the early 19th and early 20th century, was essentially a function of two states, Bengal and Maharashtra. It grew from these two. And when you see the convergence of ideas between the two, you will find that it was there. Secondly, you will find that to a very large extent, both Bengal and Maharashtra adopted methods. Their nationalism was also a rediscovery of inheritance, rediscovery of tradition, rediscovery of their own history. In both these places. Next, what we find is that since then, Bengal charted its own way, India charted its own way, and then the Yoni gap took place. Today, when we, I hope some of you have been lucky like I have in getting these COVID, anti-COVID shots, because I think I deserve it more than you, purely in age. In 1947, 70% of the pharmaceutical industry in of India was located in Bengal. Today, 7% of it is located. And not one of the COVID plants, manufacturing plants, they either in Hyderabad or in Pune. So you just got out of that. You've sort of fallen off the map. As it. Today, Bengal doesn't have head offices, it has branch offices. It's a branch office economy everywhere. Thirdly, as various people have thinking, there is a sort of one-way ticket system which is operating. Anybody who can gets out. Someone once told me this when I got to Jaffna in Sri Lanka, and they said, Jaffna is a very nice place to get out of. And one day people will start saying this word, Jaffna, it's a very nice place to spend a weekend as Sanjeev is doing. It's a lovely place. It's great. But what about productive? That's when it falls. It's great to talk about how nicely this building of Sir Biren Mukherjee with the sort of Maharaja of Kuch Bihar staring at us there. How nicely it's been done. It's wonderful. But are we living in a heritage state? Where is the newness about it? Now, I believe that this newness can come about by three things. One is Bengalis, and I'm saying Bengalis, must reject the climate of violence and hate. This is a warped offshoot of certain parts of our tradition. This sense of violence, which is so inherently now part of us. You have an argument with it. I mean, at one time we used to laugh that in Tamil Nadu someone dies, they self-immolate. And in Bengal you have an argument, it's killing. 70-year-old woman gets beaten up like India's face put like that. So that's number one. That this is at the root of all the distortion. People have prepared blueprints, roadmaps, etc. I first heard the term revival of Bengal from Siddhartha from Kure in 1972. And it's still reviving. Still the blueprints are being produced. Roadmaps are being produced. And it falters at the first hurdle. Because the environment of anything is just not conducive. There is tension, there is insecurity, there is fear, and on top of that, there is a negative work culture. And this stems from that. Previously, it was known as the city of buns, or the state of buns. Now it's the state of Tolabaj. Extortion. So that environment is there. That's the first point. So without addressing the political question, we cannot talk about the revival of Bengal. Number two, the other problem with Bengal is the problem of intense politicization. I mean, politics is important, but it's not something recent. I'll give you a small anecdote. One of the greatest nationalist leaders of the 1930s was a gentleman called Jyotindra Sengupta, after whom Deshpriya Park is named. He was a leader from Chittagong, and he had a fierce rivalry with Subhash Chandra Bose. I mean, that rivalry, they were both in the Congress, but they sort of really hated each other's guts. So, James Gupta was arrested once for violating one of the laws, and he was due to be transported to Rangoon, and that was the worst form of punishment that could be in those days. And he was being taken out from Princep Jetty here, getting onto the steamer, and someone asked him, "So, what are your last words as you get onto this thing?" And he said, "My last words? Dissolve the EC of the BPCC." In other words, this is a classic. I've often cited this as the most classic example. Yeah, the executive committee of the Bengal Pradesh Congress. That was his private. And now the point is It's all determined by what your political affiliation is. It's got to such a stage, even these days I'm fortunate or unfortunate to hobnob with a lot of Tollywood stars. And one of the things I found out there was the extent of politicization there. You get a role if you're with PP, or if you don't get a role if you're with Dada. So that's traffic accidents. You have a traffic accident, that becomes a sort of Trinamool, BJP, CPM, or whatever fight. Let me therefore suggest the most reactionary thing, that we need a spell of intense injection of depoliticization. A serious, a booster dose of depoliticization. And this is something which doesn't come about by change of government. It is a very social. It's something which Bengalis have to really realize that you've overdone it. We've overdone this bit. And that's time for some corrective action. And finally, we've again, this form of emotional supremacism which we've taken up, which is that we don't need anyone's help. The center is forever discriminating against us. So in other words, we've created a situation whereby you have decided you don't want to be in step with the rest of the country. In a lot of places, what you find, it's not that Bengal has declined. The rest of the country has moved ahead, and you haven't moved ahead correspondingly. It's not a decline in absolute terms, but it's actually relative decline. So that attitude, which you've got to rethink, that can we today, if we have to lift ourselves by the bootstraps and climb up, can we do it only by invoking the Bengal Renaissance? We can't. We can't do it only with our own resources. We can't do it only with the resources of the Bengali diaspora, Provashi Bengali, or from wherever it is. They are important, they are very important. We need the rest of the country. We need that. In other words, we need an attitude. Look at the neighboring state of Odisha, where my good friend Naveen Patnaik, who incidentally was a neighbor of Sir Biren Mukherjee. Biju Babu used to live in the then Harrington Street, now more evocatively named. So Naveen Babu is also, he belongs to the BJP. And that's different from the BJP. But when it comes to the concern of Odisha, he takes every bit possible from central help. In other words, the political idiom is shaped by a thing that we need cooperation. Of course, there will be differences. There will be major differences at times. But let us pick the differences, not have blanket things, so that when a portrait of Netaji is unveiled in Rashtrapati Bhavan, we say, no, this is not Netaji, this is Proshenji, you got it wrong. So that's how ridiculous we've become in our blind opposition to anything which comes from Delhi. So Sanjeev is going to be, he was born in Calcutta, his father was an IAS officer in Calcutta, he grew up in Broad Street, Ironside Road. But he is now, because he went to Sri Ram College of Commerce and then went to St. John's College, Oxford, so he's a Provashi, he's no longer entitled to talk about it. So let's get over this really narrow fixation. Let us be narrowed the Lakshman Rekha to such an extent that we don't have space to move any longer. Our space for maneuverability is long. I think I've taken too long, I've thrown up also made some ridiculously provocative statements, and so I'll leave it there.
Would you like to comment on the point that Dada made on the inverse correlation that there exists between economic prosperity and the economists that a state produces? For nowhere where businesses have been throttled has prosperity survived for long. Nowhere in the absence of prosperity has art and culture flourished for long.
I feel no obligation to defend the economists. It is indeed true that there is a strong inverse correlation between economic performance and winning Nobel Prizes. You see, in the first half of the 20th century, till about 1950, it used to be the British who used to win a lot of Nobel Prizes. And then they lost their empire. In the last 20 years, almost all the economists have been either American or based in the US. And you know what has happened. Meanwhile, have you ever heard of a Chinese Nobel Prize winning economist, or a Singaporean, or in the 70s and 80s, Japanese, or Korean, or Botswanian, another, by the way, a country that's the best performing African country. So, the most important indicator of whether or not about future prosperity, in addition to all the other things I talked about in the Renaissance, is that you don't have too many economists living here. The good news is, most of those people who are giving, those Nobel laureate economists and others, including my economist half, thankfully don't live here anymore. That is perhaps a precondition. And now, thanks to COVID, they can't even come during the winters to come and tell you what to do with your lives. So, there is a high possibility that the conditions are right for the reawakening of Bengal.
And they find various reasons to oppose the farm laws when they have to, support the farm laws when they have to. So as Sanjeev said, there's a clear and direct inverse correlation between academic economist success and actual economist.
If one were to look at the Bengal Renaissance, and this is something which Dada touched upon, the first seeds of the Renaissance were actually sowed by Europeans. Would you like to comment on that, Dada? Europeans. The first seeds of the Renaissance were actually sown by Europeans, by the likes of Sir William Jones, founder of the Asiatic Society.
I think it was really the convergence of European thought. I mean, if we look at Raja Rammohn Roy as being one of the early examples, I think you will find the extent to which Unitarianism, in other words, certain facets of Christian theology, and not to mention thoughts of Bentham and others, influenced him. He was very much a part of that. Of course, he was not exclusively a product of that. He also had other things. But then you had other people. Now, question is, who do you choose? In that area, you had Michael Madhusudan, who at one time decided that the only way to become a real progressive was to repudiate everything. And then he changed his mind. And he also symbolized one facet. But we forget other people like Gudev Mukherjee, who was also a great one, who was a member of a Masonic lodge, but also believed that the Shastras told you everything. This sort of lovely contradiction which existed. Ishwar Chandra Vidyashankar, who believed that the Sanskrit college curriculum must not have any units or paper or anything on Western philosophy. He said, put up minded. We must only look at that. So you had all these. Then you had people, we forgot people like Pandit Shashadhar Tarak Chudam. Very few people have even heard of him. He was a quirky sort of man who believed that nothing which had existed in India or sciences was ever not revealed by the Vedas. And he had a great following. I mean, if the others had 100 or 200 people in the audience, he would get thousands flocking to his meetings. You forget that in 1891, the age of consent bill, the greatest opposition to it also came from Kolkata. So, you only look at one side of what is the Renaissance. There was a lot of intellectual ferment. And I think there was a contestation. There was various people who said various things. Do we realize, for example, that the word Hindutva was actually coined
remembered, as Swapan has just pointed out, only one sort of, I would call it the Brahmo response or the young Indians response. There were many responses. And in fact, the traditionalists also had amazing responses, which are quite interesting, in which, by the way, the women played a bigger role. People have very often do not include in the Bengal Renaissance characters like Rani Bhavani, Rani Rashmani, and others who were very, Dakshinash temple were built by Rani, not by, Bengali intellectuals of College Street. So they were an important part of that. And that lineage, by the way, in some ways has had, not in our textbooks, but in real life, the bigger impact. Because Dakshineshwar, Ramakrishna to Vivekananda, Vivekananda to all the revolutionaries that you had, that's a direct lineage of thought and ideas and action. And as Swapan also pointed out, when some of these characters stood up to speak, they would literally get tens of thousands of people coming to listen to them in many multiples of what those who we have now characterized as the Renaissance men used to do. In fact, in many ways, this issue is best exemplified by Aurobindo Ghosh. Well, Aurobindo Ghosh actually came from a Brahmo family. Now, one of the branches of the Brahmos had actually over time drifted off and become so Europeanized that they began to repudiate everything that was Indian or Hindu or Bengali. And one of those was Sri Aurobindo's father. So much so he sent him off to live in England at a very young age and told the caretaker that he should not be exposed in any way to anything Indian. So it was only in his late teens, when he was preparing for the civil service examinations in Cambridge, that he actually rediscovered Sanskrit, Bengali, Hinduism, and so on. And it was really his reaction. And so you've seen he's also part of the Bengal Renaissance, but you can clearly see, very clearly delineated in himself how his response then was. I mean, he became a revolutionary. He's the founder of the revolutionary movement, in fact, along with Savarkar. And of course, then became, drifted off and became a full-time spiritual thinker.
Sanjeev, you mentioned Aurobindo, who famously in the Uttarpara speech said, Sanatan Dharma, that is nationalism. This is the message that I have to speak to you. Any of you all like to comment on that? What is what relevance does that hold in the context of the Re-Awakening?
Saying that, I used to think that we need to worship the nation state, but actually for us, Sanatan Dharma is the real nationalism before we went to Pondicherry. So I think I just want to quickly come to one point which Dada very lightly mentioned and Sanjeev amplified, was that it was a very strong intellectual fermentation. It was not one way reform. So, for example, when the Brahmos were proposing certain reforms, there was a very strong counter reaction by Radhakanta Dev, Dharma Sabha. And in fact, when Ishwar Vidyasagar got a lot of signatures for Widow Remarriage Act in 1856, Radhakanta Dev got 4 times signatures against him. Although eventually Vidyasagar prevailed. But even again in Vidyasagar's case, he was against people of so-called lower caste to study in Sanskrit in Hindu college, so Sanskrit in Sanskrit college. Whereas Radhakanta Dev, the conservative or the traditionalist, actually was socially reformist in other areas and started Hindu college, part of which became presidency and all that. So it was they were very complex, nuanced people like Michael Madhusudan that Dr. Dada kind of referred to, who kind of left everything, became a Christian, but towards the end of the life, he had this sense of, am I missing my roots? And there is a very strong sense, again, in Aurobindo Ghosh, to answer your question directly, of are we too deracinated? Like, have we gone too far and now we need to step back?
No, in fact, he had said, as goes Sanatan Dharma, so goes Bharat. In so many words.
He said that basically Bharat is a subset of Sanatan Dharma, that if Sanatan Dharma could die, Bharat would also die. But I just want to add one point, there is a character of Germanic folk hero from 2000 years ago called Arminius. So Arminius actually fought the Roman Empire and defeated them brutally. But actually he was brought up by the Romans themselves. He was one of those kids who was captured, brought up as a Roman general. And many Bengali Renaissance revolutionaries, conservative, less conservative, there was a sense of we have Europeanized, but we can never fully Europeanize. Our real roots are different. So it never went the Philippines way. It never fully converted. It never went the Brazilian way. So it was always, even Raja Ram Mohan Roy, a lot of people confuse him as a Christian. He was never a Christian. Protestant padres and Anglican padres hated him in Bengal. He used utilitarian's kind of very broad humanitarian framework to push what he wanted to push through. So it's very important not to miss, as Sanjeev very rightly said, it was a response to European colonialism. It wasn't a version of European colonialism as multifaceted as it was.
So we have Aurobindo on nationalism, and then on the other hand, we also have Tagore, who's often quoted, and I dare say misquoted given the volume of his work on both sides of the debate. Would anyone from the panel like to come in and navigate the dichotomy on nationalism vis-a-vis the take of Sri Aurobindo and, let's say, a Tagore?
See, it's a very complicated story, Rabindranath and nationalism. You have the early Rabindranath during the Swadeshi movement, who wrote some of the most passionate songs on nationalism. And despite being a Brahmo, he even conceived of Mother India in different ways. And after that, I think to a very large extent, there was a breaking point in around 1921 when he fiercely opposed Gandhi's non-cooperation movement. I mean, very few people know this, that he had some of the harshest words to say about Gandhi's non-cooperation movement. Some of those letters and with the exchanges with Rabindranath and Gandhi are very, very revealing. And Rabindranath became thoroughly unpopular in a lot of places because of this stand. And later, because of his opposition to Japanese, his slim book Nationalism, which is often referred to and by most people as being the absolute sort of repudiation of everything, is actually a very sharp critique of Japanese militarism. So Rabindranath and people like Niraj Chaudhuri, of course, calls it Niraj Chaudhuri never minced words, so he called it a spurious universalism of Tagore. But anyway, let's not get into that. The point is, Rabindranath Tagore had a view of nationalism which was very, very different from that of Aurobindo, which was very different from that of Subhash Bose, which was very different even from that of Gandhi. Except they had a very, like Gandhi, he had a very nostalgic and a very romantic view of what constitutes rural life and the self-sufficient. So the point is, we should understand what these various people said. They didn't necessarily say the same thing. They all had different points of view. That doesn't undermine their own greatness, and that doesn't make their message the gospel. And that's really.
The message is not gospel. I think those are words to remember. Rajiv, if you would like to.
No, I was just going to say on nationalism. Now, there are some writers these days who are trying to make a distinction between ethnic nationalism and civic nationalism. So, obviously, nationalism has a history in India of being a principally anti-colonial movement, right? So, obviously, we were fighting for independence, and that's where the nationalist movement sort of had its roots. But this attempt to sort of make a distinction between civic and ethnic nationalism is also quite spurious, because ultimately it's about defending certain values. Now, whether that value set comes under threat from an external force or even internal sort of groups, if those values have to be defended, there are certain things about which I'm sure most people would agree there cannot be any two views on it. So when it comes to defending those values, and if someone tries to label it as ethnic versus civic and so on, I don't think that really holds.
See, Tagore's criticism of nationalism was very much in a European and Japanese context. It was about the interwar. He was looking at these Westphalian states, which were very ethno-linguistically homogeneous, and he could not understand why they were killing each other. So again, if Bihar, Odisha, West Bengal were to be separate nation states in India, and they were fighting each other, somebody like Tagore would say, why are we killing each other? So you have to distinguish between that Westphalian, European, Japanese kind of nationalism versus what he was definitely a civilizationist. Some of his less well-known quotes are where he says there are two religions in the world who are out to proselytize, and they will never rest at peace until they convert everybody. This is Rabindranath Tagore's quotation. So this is the same Rabindranath Tagore that people are claiming to be some kind of left liberal hero. So there again a very complex, very nuanced figure, and nationalism was seen very much in the European and Japanese context, not in the present context of Indian nationalism.
So on nationalism,
Why don't we get the audience?
if somebody could take a mic around and we could probably get some questions from the audience in as well.
My name is Devajyoti, and thanks Sanjeev and thanks you, Mr. Dasgupta. So I'm also one of them who just fled away from Bengal just to save myself. So coming back to this question of nationalism, now we heard this Didi's call like Joy Bangla or something. Now we know what Joy Bangla is. So what is wrong with this Bengali nationalism? After all, we are all discussing here about re-awakening Bengal, right? So it's a Bengali nationalism we are discussing. So what is wrong with Bengali nationalism? I was studying in Milan, so I was discussing with.
If you could please ask your question.
Okay, okay. So probably what is wrong with Bengali nationalism with Joy Bangla? That's Mamata Banerjee's probably.
See, I don't think when we talk of India as a civilization, as I mentioned, if we had a Bengali nation state and an Odia nation state, that would be Bengali and Odia nationalism. India is more analogous to the European Union, not to France or Belgium or Germany or Spain or Portugal. So you can have Spanish nationalism, quote unquote, but it is definitely today in the framework of European Union. We are even more coherent, organically united. So it's more about semantics. You can call India the civilization, the superset, and whether you want to call it Bengali or Haryanvi sub-nationalism or nationalism, it's ultimately a matter of words. So of course, we should be proud of our individual regional identities. Should we use the word nationalism for it or sub-nationalism? I think that's a matter of difference of degree, not a fundamental difference. The super framework is about a civilization. And so, for example, Rajiv and I in a book, we say that India is a civilization that is now becoming a modern nation. It was not a modern nation, of course, earlier. This is now becoming a modern nation because I can get up and go to Bangalore or Pune or Gurgaon and then come back to Calcutta and live in a very seamless manner, which was not the case for our grandparents, for example. So I think the right word is sub-nationalism, and that is a completely organic and legitimate feeling that we should encourage.
Say one thing. At the beginning of this discussion, I think it was Harsh who asked the question that as a school child, he was bewildered as to why the eastern state of India is called West Bengal. And I think and it comes to your question, we have to ask ourselves, why is this place called West Bengal? In the context of the question, a very legitimate question which you asked. Why isn't it Bengal? In 1947, 46 actually, when the whole scheme of separatism was envisaged, it was envisaged that Bengal would go and become a part of Pakistan. Instead, we had West Bengal and East Bengal. Why? Now you ask yourself that question, why? I'm not going to go into that history. Why was West Bengal created? It was created for a particular reason. Because the people of West Bengal, or let's put it more bluntly, that the Hindus of Bengal felt a greater affinity towards India than they felt towards anything else. To my mind, that is also one of the reasons why we don't want a greater Bangladesh. And I would rather think of Joy Bangla as that dreaded eye disease which infected a lot of people in the 1970s and 80s rather than a political slogan.
Hello. This little longish question, but I'll just go ahead. Would you say that political reawakening is the solution for reawakening of any state or specifically for Bengal? Is there any reawakening possible without it, also given the limited political leadership choices we face? Or would you say that it is us, the people of Bengal, as Swapan Das said, who have to change with respect to rejecting hate and violence? And will change of environment automatically change the political leadership and put it in place, and they'll be forced to reawaken themselves? Thank you.
So, the way I would think of it is that ultimately politics, even economics, etc., are downstream of culture and mindset. So, the first thing we have to change is that whether or not we as a society, and I'm going to say Bengalis, want actually something different from what has been going on in the recent few decades. Now, if you don't want it, then that's the end of the conversation. So then we should just continue with what it is. Clearly, those assembled in this room, at least those, think that we should be doing something else. And that awakening itself is step number one. By the way, as I said, a lot of this is in response. Every Renaissance happens in response to whatever was happening, is going on, or a threat or something that preceded it. So in the case of the Europeans, it was the series of religious wars that were going on in Europe. It happens in response to the Roman Catholics churches complete control over the intellectual life, over large amounts of the economy in terms of their holdings of land, and so on. And that is the context in which their Renaissance happened. It was a response to it. And by the way, it happened equally in the Protestant and in the Roman Catholic parts of Europe in different ways. The Bengal Renaissance we were discussing was first and foremost an intellectual response to colonization. We were the first part of India to be properly colonized. We faced, consequently, the worst of it in terms, for example, the 1770 famine, which was unbelievable. We also, by the way, faced the last famine in 1943, but the 1770 famine was really devastating. This was also the part of India that deindustrialized first, because Bengal was the place where textile really came from. This was a textile producing part of the world. And when the Industrial Revolution happens in Europe, this is the place that deindustrialized first. By the way, many people know that Kolkata was 3 villages, and the Job Charnock took it over, etc. Very important to remember that those who lived in those villages were, for the most part, they were weavers. The Boshaks and the Roy Chaudhurys, etc., were essentially merchants of cloth. That's why Job Charnock came in the first place. They weren't really farmers living in those villages. So these were weaver villages. And so all the point I'm making is that first and foremost, there has to be a period of intellectual churn, a acceptance by society at large, but certainly by the thinking classes to start with, that look, we need something to change. And sometimes that happens simultaneously and sometimes it precedes it. The 1991 reforms that happened in India was not preceded by intellectual change. Actually, in that case, we had an economic collapse. The Soviet Union collapsed along with it, and we were forced to do the reforms. The intellectual class in India actually did not want those reforms, and I remember very clearly, and some of you may be old enough to do so as well, that the intellectual class of India actually was against the 1991 reform. It was in the 90s that a new group of people, some of them of my age group, who basically emerged out of the change that was forced upon us and then embraced the new kind of market-based open economics. But very often, the mindset change perhaps should happen first, and I think that would make it a lot easier, because then it begins to pervade through into various things. People forget the extent to which the intellectual framework that you have drives what you do, not so much the conclusions you reach or even the evidence that is placed. Once you have a certain intellectual framework and it's grown in the soil, it drives the events afterwards. In the case of economic reforms in India, the reason even today we keep debating reforms that are blatantly obviously needed is because the reforms started before the intellectual change. Otherwise, it would have been much easier. So this is continuously, it's still a struggle today to do obvious reforms in India. It's only in 2021 that we have dared to begin unapologetically to use the word privatization. Come on. But this is the point. So I hope that through the intellectual churn that we are hopefully going through here in Bengal, the first thing that changes is the mindset, the cultural context. Most other things will actually flow from it.
Hello. So my question is that Mr. Sanyal, you said in your opening remarks that Bengalis hate innovation. So what about incentivizing innovation? You know, like suppose the Prime Minister Garib Kalyan Yojana, subject to as and when it gets here, it can be like now it is 6,000 per quarter. It can be 5,000 per quarter and 1,000 worth of securities of some growing company which is over here right now. So that way, if some people start having a skin in the game, they'll automatically do the required effort intellectually to accept innovation. It's just my thought. I just want to know whether it's a good thought or not.
No, I think that probably gets too specific. You know, you are talking about a particular scheme or something, and ultimately, this is not about handouts. I think what Sanjeev was referring to was, again, like if you go back to the words he was using, mindset, thinking. So risk taking is also what he used in his opening remarks. Where you have risk taking, where you have a certain mindset to try new things, you're open to new ideas, then sort of good things happen.
Yeah, I think that's the point. I mean, I don't know about the specific scheme you're talking about, but the point I'm making is that while there may be case for government intervention in certain areas to get maybe infant industries, etc., going, as a general principle, the state should not be involved in trying to sort of do this. I would argue that would sort of get in the way of the risk taking in itself, because that would mean that a group of bureaucrats would be deciding what it is that they should be innovating in. And I would argue that that usually does not lead to good outcomes. Now, I know somebody will say Singapore does it so well. Yeah, maybe Singapore can get away with it. But, you know, having lived in Singapore for a long time, let me say, even their approach is not as state-led as people think it is. A state does have a role, but its role should be essentially in background things like infrastructure, making sure the regulations are simple, and those kinds of things. And Singapore does a fabulous, fabulous job of that first. Picking winners, occasionally the government does pick good winners, but the Singapore, Temasek, and all these other institutions also back plenty of losers. So I think their real strength is not in the picking winners part, but in providing the environment for foreign and domestic entrepreneurship to do their thing. So given that background, I would say the state can provide some of the overall infrastructure for doing the innovation. Ultimately, the innovation has to be done by society at large. The state getting out of the way is a very important part of that. And that is also true of cultural innovation. Till, I think, only 15 years ago, it was not allowed by the state to perform Rabindranath's works in any other way except for the prescribed way as given by the state, by Vishwabharati, by the state. So, you know, you actually had created the most absurd situation where Rabindranath Tagore, who's one of his most famous poems, says, you know, there should be not narrow domestic walls holding back innovation. And what do you do with his works? Build narrow domestic walls. This is completely absurd. So I think that is very important, that we need to stop having this idea that the state has to mollycoddle all of this. It doesn't. Risk taking is a way of life.
May I just say something? Maybe it's in answer to that. In the early 90s, a lot of us used to ask a basic question: why are there so many Indians in this world who are succeeding, but not India? So let me ask this question here in this context: why are there so many Bengalis all over the world who are making a mark, but not in Bengal? And I think you'll get the answer to that in this survey.
Sanjeev speaks of innovation. Rajiv, you are a venture capitalist. We speak of jobs. Do you think Bengal has the necessary ingredients to become a hub for startups and innovation?
No, see, it is actually astonishing, to Dada's point. It is actually astonishing. A state which has, I think, India's first IIM, India's first IIT, the ISI, Indian Statistical Institute, Presidency College, Jadavpur University, all these great institutions where thousands of students come every year. They come here, they get their degrees and they leave. In many other ecosystems, what would normally happen is that the students would build their lives where they studied. This is often what happens in other countries. If you look at the east coast of the US, if you look at the west coast, if you look at the United Kingdom, the Oxford, Cambridge and London. So people who study there build their lives over there. Why does it happen that those who come to study in Bengal at these great institutions, why don't they stay here? I think that is worth thinking about.
We have more questions.
My question to Sanjeev sir. Sir, if I come to the point just after independence, we have seen the economy of Calcutta getting degraded. My specific question is, was it programmed to do in that way, or did it go naturally? And the second part of that question is, what happened to the middle class? The middle class of before 1947, did they just fade out with the degrading economy, and that was that space taken by the elites who were once the sympathizers of the colonial rule?
I think they are two somewhat different questions. It is true that a significant proportion of the immediate post-independence upper middle class and elite continued to be those who had been collaborators with the British. That is actually true. But that is incidentally not just true of Bengal, which may have had a disproportionate number of them, but it was true of all of India. And so if you look at many of the, in the first 4-5 decades after independence, many of those who were senior civil servants, thinkers, writers, etc., either were themselves or were direct descendants of those who had collaborated. That is actually a fact. And that's a different story to be told. But I think your point was, what happened after was it inevitable that Bengal went into decline? Which is a somewhat different issue. And I would argue, no, nothing is inevitable. And by the way, I'm a chaos theory guy, so my starting premise is that there is nothing predestined about history. So since there's nothing predestined about history, India could have gone, or Bengal in particular, could have gone in multiple ways. After all, in 1950, the area around Kolkata was the most industrialized part of Asia outside of Japan. And Japan's economy had been completely devastated. So this was the biggest functioning industrial hub east of the Suez. And for a while, it actually did rather well. In the 1950s, new investments were coming in. There were Sir Biren, who lived in this house, took the very first World Bank loan for a private enterprise, for a steel company, IISC, right? ISCO. And that company for a while in the 60s was India's largest steel producer, if I'm not mistaken. It was huge. It's a different matter that it all went belly up. And as I said, mindset had a lot to do with it, because whether the Naxalite movement and later on the actual capture of power by the communists and so on, there was clearly a direction that Bengali society decided to take at some level. One can blame the political leaders or whatever, but in the end, it's all a reflection ultimately of the mindset of that time, for whatever reason we chose in a particular direction. I don't think it was inevitable. History very often takes a sudden turn in an instant. I mean, what may have happened if the arrow did not hit Hemu's eye in the second battle of Panipat? It could have gone in a totally different direction. So I'm a firm believer that a lot of direction of history is not some Marxist inevitable train, but is a complex, chaotic system going in various directions. Very impossible to tell where it may have gone otherwise, but it is not the case that there's anything inevitable about anything, or even about what will happen from here on.
At the same time, while I agree with you, I think it's all the same, it's important to note one thing, that the process of steady decline of West Bengal had the intellectual sanction of all the Bengali thought leaders of that time. This is, I think, something, I mean, I would call some of them intellectual criminals. And that really, to my mind, it's something you have to break. So if you're talking about, I mean, it's more than a renaissance. I think you need a certain mental revolution in Bengal to actually get up and get yourself going once again.
I'll agree with that. I totally agree with you. All I'm saying is that it was not inevitable that we went down that path of intellectual stagnation. In the sense, so that's the only point I'm making. I totally agree with you. By the way, those of you who read my fiction will know that I spend a great deal of time mocking the intellectuals of College Street. There is a story called The Intellectuals. Please do read it. It's a satirical story about them. I more than agree with Swapan on this.
I'm afraid we only have time for one more question. The gentleman at the front, he's been raising his hand. If somebody could get him a mic. You can ask. Okay,
Hello.
sure. Go on.
Hi, this is Ayush. I would like to know what are the obvious and non-obvious unique advantages that Bengal has over any other state, if there are. And I have one more question to add to it.
I can answer that one very quickly. I think, Bengal is the only densely populated state in India which has a seafront. So if you look at the Indian map, the demographics map, East UP and Bihar are the two other very densely populated regions, but they don't have a sea access right now. And historically, Ganga was the navigation for men and material. But we built more canals, irrigation, and then that area we did not build roads after independence. Railways carried on from the British time. And then even parts of Bihar and Jharkhand fell behind. There was freight nationalization, which communists talk about all the time. And that was true. So Bengal is one of the few places which is extremely dense. We need more cities in Bengal other than Calcutta. If you build a very good highway or expressway from here through Malda, through Murshidabad to Siliguri, Durgapur, that entire region, any rich state like Maharashtra or Gujarat has multiple successful cities. But we are close to the Bay of Bengal. We have Haldia, we have the port, we have the Ganga here, Hooghly here. So we have and some of the most fertile land in the world. We just need to understand that we have to industrialize, and on the white collar job, we have to bring in capital. We have to reject unionism. And right now, capital, domestic or foreign, has many other locations to go to. It has no obligation to Bengal. As somebody in the stock market, when I go and talk to people in Mumbai, and I say, what about this company is multiple? They say, PE multiple is a price to earning multiple. They say, Bengal, Kolkata ka hai, to theek hai, 15 ke badle 10 de denge. Whether it is fair or not, that is the reputation right now. And when you are, what happens is reality changes first, reputation changes later. So even if reality changes, reputation will take some time. It might be accelerated if we have a political change, to put it very bluntly. But we need to get the reality changed. Reputation change is not in our hands. But the capital will come extremely fertile land, as Rajiv mentioned, both natural and human resources. As Dada mentioned, Sanjeev mentioned, great universities, great institutions. There is no reason why, if all these people are going to Bengaluru or Pune or outside of India, you just need to have a startup ecosystem here. And then everything is here in any case. So it's just about putting that spark together.
This is the last question. After that, we can continue the discussion over tea.
Thank you, everyone, for this absolutely amazing discussion that we have had so far. My question is very simple. Net, we know that the economic decline, the political decline, and at some level, the social decline has happened. And given where we are, is it possible that the intellectual think tank / intellectual criminals wake up out of this slumber? Is it possible as of now? I know you do not think anything is inevitable, but is it possible? If yes, what do you think would move that forward? Thank you.
As I said, it's possible but not inevitable. A lot of it depends on what society and its leadership, intellectual and political or commercial, gets together and does. Everything comes from hard work, directed effort. In the end, what wins is effort and will, not predestination. Because if you went by where the most fertile land was or where the density was, all these are post facto, you can see that this was why it succeeded. But there were, at every point in time, there are similar places which could have succeeded. Why is Bangladesh, for example, doing suddenly very well in the last 10 years? The land has not changed. The density of population has not changed that much. So good leadership and here, in some ways, an elite that decides to take the country in a certain direction. By elite, I mean basically whoever are the thought leaders, commercial leaders, political leaders of that time, think that yes, we need to get up and just do it. And in some ways, that is what happened repeatedly in Europe. Europe was devastated by these wars, not just the two world wars, the Napoleonic Wars, and there were several wars year after year. And the thing that allowed these societies to end up dominating the world for several hundred years is that for a period of time, they had a intellectual and political leadership which had enormous confidence. I mean, one of the things that strikes you when you read, for example, about Victorian explorers or scientists is the enormous confidence they have in themselves. Okay, sometimes perhaps too overconfident, but it's quite extraordinary that these people were going and, deciding with atrociously poor equipment to, ski across Antarctica to be the first guy to the South Pole. Why would one want to do it? But their thinking was, we'll do it because it's there. And that mindset was definitely about a risk-taking culture. And that culture, by the way, Europe and now perhaps even the US is losing. But maybe we will go through that phase where we will develop it. And by the way, when we talk about ancient Indian history and we are very proud of it, remember we also, during our golden age, also had these kind of spirit. After all, somebody from Bengal, Odisha region sailed out all the way and colonized Sri Lanka and then sailed eastward, went to the Mekong Delta. So, this was also a sailing culture, a risk-taking culture, and risk-taking in multiple fields simultaneously. So I think that is something that needs to be triggered. So I think that moment may be arriving, but as I said, that nothing is predestined.
If any of our speakers have any closing remarks, I think they've said everything that they have to. In conclusion, I'd like to thank our speakers once again. Sanjeev Sanyal, Dr. Swapan Dasgupta, Harsh and Rajiv. I would like to thank each and every one of y'all for being here today, for being such a lovely audience. I hope that all of y'all go back home stirred, if not awakened, and that perhaps we may witness Bengal's reawakening sooner rather than later. Thank you.
Hopefully stirred and not shaken.
I would like to thank all of you on behalf of Young Indians and IEC for being here today. The economist in me is always skeptical about Bengal, but being here today has really reawakened the skepticism, if nothing else. And I would like to ask you a question out of fiction, if that makes any sense. I think Bengal is in a vicious cycle of politicization, laziness, for a lack of a better word, and maybe content in a negative connotation. If we were to bring this out of this vicious cycle, who is the one person in the world you think would be able to do that? Let's all of us think about who is that one person in the world who can maybe make that change and get the, yeah? And get all of us to maybe intellectually get our mindsets right, as all of them have pointed out time and again. Let's try to move towards this new journey that Bengal should now get onto. Young Indians always believes we can, we will. And let me leave you all with that thought. Thank you, Rajeev and Harsh. Your book has I think everybody who's read the book has started thinking in the right direction, if not more. Thank you, Mr. Sanyal. It's always such a pleasure to hear you talk about, in such ease about things that have so much depth. Thank you, Swapan Da, for bringing the flavor of Bengal and some humor to this very serious topic otherwise. Thank you all for joining us today. And as he said, we can always continue with tea.